Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this second panel in our doctoral training event, which is organised by the Irish Humanities Alliance. So we've just had an excellent session this morning on academic publication, and I think we all learned a great deal. Our second panel now explores social media in academia, and I can now hand over to our IHA Vice Chair, Dr. Maxim Fomin from Ulster University, and he will chair and introduce this second panel.
Thank you, Mel. Well, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Donald Mulligan from Dublin City University School of Communications. His research concerns political discourse and participation in online spaces, mediation by technology of collaborative work, and third-level education. Dónal is a member of the university's interdisciplinary digital research group and is interested in promoting and improving collaborative hybrid research in humanities and social sciences. He will speak today about various approaches we take as researchers on social networks and media channels, and particularly Twitter. And I hand over to Dónal. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maxime, and hello, everyone. I'm going to share my slides with you, if that's okay, and we'll run through some of the fairly broad theme that I've been given for today that I hope I'll be able to do quick justice to. The particular thing that I've been asked to speak about is fairly wide-ranging, and I'll begin just by introducing myself. Hello, I'm Dónal. I'm, as Maxime said, in DCU, and I'm also on the board of the IHA. I'm part of an interdisciplinary digital research group at DCU that looks at a lot of methodology building within research that relates to big data and data we collect from social media channels. So because of that, and because I also want to make this talk accessible and useful for as many people as possible, I'm going to really look at the relevance of social media to academia in two parts. The first is as a site of research itself, which I'll briefly go through because I understand that this will be useful to some, but perhaps not most of the attendees. And I also want to talk about it as a site of collaboration, which I think is more generally useful for everybody, especially how it might be used by us to build our profiles and to increase the communication about our work in particular. As a site of research, it's very attractive to a lot of people in the social sciences and the humanities in particular, because it gives us access to vast and often emergent situated discourses around reactions to social events or reactions to particular areas within our various segments of the humanities. And it can also sort of ground our work and be a very useful source of qualitative input in things that we're looking at. It's also a place where discussion of artifacts and performance happens quite a lot, and it's somewhere that I think a lot of people are drawn to as a secondary or primary source, especially in grounded theory approaches and mixed methods approaches. It's very variant in its accessibility, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. But one of the barriers to using social media as a site of research in and of itself is that the various kinds of social media channels are quite disparate in the way in which you can connect to them and collect data from them. There's also a reliance on tools and methods for doing that, and there's barriers with that in terms of cost, in some cases to do with licensing or software, or indeed the buying of data directly. And also there's a higher bar on technical competence with some of the ways in which we would interact with social media as a site of research. There's also a navigating of very complex ethical issues that I think is something that I'm interested myself as the ethics chair in my faculty at DCU. But I think it is an emergent area for a lot of us who are doing work where social media becomes a site of research because of issues around privacy and of expectations of privacy by the users themselves. It's also, as a site of research, very Twitter focused. So we talk about social media in general, but when we look at the vast majority of studies within academia that are taking social media as their source, they're often taking Twitter as the source. Of course, there are situated studies within closed social media channels like Facebook or Instagram, but the majority where grounded theory approaches or where information building is concerned are using Twitter because of its sort of affordances in terms of how it organizes conversation, how it allows for quite selective text gathering and things like that. As a site of collaboration, which I'll go into in more detail, of course, it has huge potential for us to build early career profile and to build our strategic network of collaboration across different universities and institutions. It's an inherently communicative participation. It's something that we can do that keeps us talking with increasingly wide sort of circles of related people. It sorts information for us in very useful ways, and it's obviously a place that many of us turn to when we want to try and build those early connections that we need. But again, there's a reliance here too, and that's on competencies around how to effectively access it, how to share information in ways that will be picked up and be useful to people. And it can be potentially very intimidating to new users, unfamiliar users, or people who have used social media for personal use before and are trying to move into a more professional capacity or to use it as part of their work in their doctoral studies and beyond. And of course, there's a navigating problem here because there are norms of participation in different social media channels, especially norms of participation for academic users. And there are some expectations that I'll mention briefly that I think are useful for us to play up to and play against in various forms when we want to use those channels. And of course, here too, it's largely Twitter focused also. When we talk about social media for collaboration and communication amongst academics, we're usually talking about Twitter also, because that tends to be where a lot of this discourse takes place, as distinct from those more closed networks like Instagram, like Facebook, etc. And because this is a social media thing, and because I'm talking about the web, I would be crazy not to use a big lump of clickbait to keep you here. So the other thing I'm going to talk about is the one amazing secret of social media for academia, which I'll come back to at the end. So let's go to a site of research first. One of the things that I think is very important for us to remember in using social media in our research is that our ethnographic embedding in it is really essential to our ability to parse how it's being used by others, to understand the communities, the affordances, the conventions, the limitations within it. So it's very difficult to adopt a use of, say, Twitter as a source of research data if you're not already a fairly experienced user, if you don't already have a good understanding of the kinds of communities or discourse that you want to measure. And we might talk about that a little bit more later. On Twitter, that's the dynamics of how hashtags are used. It's very important to understand what ones are used by what subsections of communities or what different areas of the discourse, what the norms are for conversational structure, retweeting, things like that. Because if you are gathering data, you need to know how the data is relevant to certain conversational threads. You need to be aware of the limitations of data collection in all social media formats, but especially in Twitter. The access points that you use, especially the free access points that you use, will have limitations on them in terms of the temporal relevance. Is this something that's just from the last 2 weeks or 10 days? The representative sampling. Who are the people who are the user base for this, and what subsection of them am I looking at? How generalizable are my conclusions if I've taken them from various social media channels? And also the completeness. If you have a set of data collected from social media, is that the entirety of that data, or is that a subsample? And again, depending on the tools you're using, you might be only seeing a representative random 1% or random 10% sample, and you may be missing whole sections of the discourse because of that. It's very important that we primarily and from the beginning, if we're using this as a site of research, understand that users have expectations of privacy, which may often be at odds with the declared end user license agreement expectation of privacy that might be set up by the social media platform. And part of our ethical responsibility in this area is to understand how users are expecting privacy to operate for them and to try and respect that in our approaches. And this is a complex issue that, I mean, could be an entire conference on our own, so I won't go into it immediately, but it's something that myself and colleagues at IDRG and DCU are very interested in. And if it's something that you're interested in too, please get in contact. My email address and my Twitter handle are on the screen, and I'd be happy to direct you to resources. I think this is something that could have an entire workshop on its own, so I'm going to move off it and instead talk about Twitter and social media as a site of collaboration, which might be useful to more people. Here, I think there's two very important initial points that I want to make. The first is that if you're moving into the space and you're intending to use it for collaboration within your own work, you should follow and manage a list of the journals, the institutions, the sort of associations that are relevant to your area. And you should look at it not only within your immediate disciplinary area, but as a potential for interdisciplinary connection as well. So you'll build out the following that you have and the people you are following over time. But one of the things to keep in mind is that you don't silo yourself too much. We lament the echo chamber nature of social media a lot, and this can also, in a very different sense, constrain the way in which we find opportunities as academics to collaborate if we're a little bit too narrow in the kinds of places that we follow. One of the other things that I think is quite important is to follow the news and journalists that are operating within the same spaces as you. So if your discipline is being reported on or is being seen as a contributor to news or to sort of public discourse in other ways, it's important to follow the people who are picking up on that, because you can then see the patterns of what is and is not getting picked up. You can see the way in which other academics are being successful in getting their information out there, and just looking at that and being aware of that is really very useful. You need to respect the etiquette for tagging and the use of hashtags. So again, try and understand that if you don't, and again, I'm quite happy to follow up, and perhaps we might do an entire other workshop on this at another point. But don't be so shy of it that you don't tag the important people when you strategically need to. So the publications, when you have publications, you should be tagging your journal, you should be tagging the relevant things for that. The same with conferences. And judicious use of hashtags, not overpiling them in, is very useful for forming your place within that discourse and being found and being connected with. There are useful tools that you can pick up within Twitter itself in particular. So the scheduling feature, I would encourage you, if you're a new user, to consider using as much as you can, because this is allowing you to sort of decide when the tweet that you might want to put out about your piece of research or about your contribution is happening, so you're not having to do things in real time. And you can be very strategic about times of the day that you're going to get more views, which tend to be the afternoon and early evening for the most part. And if you're like me and you do a lot of your work in the middle of the night, you don't want to tweet about it in the middle of the night and have it lost. So small things like that make a huge difference to the impact you will have within those spaces. Relevant formats and understanding them, being able to structure a thread well. And so again, you should see examples of good Twitter threads by academics, see how they're packaging that information and how they're making it clear for others. Avoid broadcast interaction where you're just doing the equivalent of putting a press release into the space. You're just dropping a link to another website or a link to a shared Google document, and you're not involved in any discourse afterwards, or you're not picking up on conversation afterwards. Be careful as well of kind of performative versions of dominant tropes within Twitter. So I see a lot of academics are emulating kind of marketing communications that happens, and I hope I'm not insulting any of my colleagues by saying this, but a current theme that's very strong at the moment are emoji-based bullet lists, where the emoji are often not particularly well connected. So we might have a picture of a potato and then new research on whatever, and so they're sort of, you know, a little bit performative, and they might be initially eye-catching, but I think they do devalue and differently contextualize information depending on how they're taken up. So be present enough within the space of your particular discipline and of academic Twitter or academic social media generally to know the kinds of ways that are effective for showing your discourse in useful manners and not having it perhaps boxed in with other kinds of things in those same spaces. Consider following keywords and hashtags that are relevant to your research in addition to following people. So you can on Twitter, for example, follow things like the PhD chat hashtag so that you see new occurrences of that. But there will be hashtags or there will be keywords that are specific to your areas of interest. And it's worth following those and having a curated kind of information feed on those kind of things as well, especially if they're very specific ones, because that's a real gateway into finding things for your particular subject area. Finally, guard your time really carefully on this. So network building can be great, but it's largely serendipitous. It's largely a thing that happens organically over time, is built up by connection and by chance in many cases. But all the time that you're there, it can be very fruitlessly distracting in the meantime, and it can be a huge time sink for academics as for anybody else. And I think it's worth thinking of it as a kind of component of the dissemination of your work, or a component of your informing yourself about practices, and therefore having an idea about how you might want to set aside certain times for it. And again, you could strategically do those at times that are good for interaction generally, so afternoons or early evenings, that sort of thing. Look at good practice within the spaces and emulate that. Curate a list for yourself of established academics in your discipline area whom you admire or whose interaction that you think is a good model for the practice you want to emulate yourself. And this is probably the best piece of advice I can give for early career academics, is to look at what's effective for other people. If your disciplinary area is one that you want to get picked up in the news, or that you want to get certain kind of traction with, look at who's doing that effectively already. How are they structuring their information? Who are they tagging? What sort of hashtags are they using? What sort of audience are they responsive to? How are they structuring that information in threads, or how are they using a sort of summary systems that are accessible to the various audiences? This is going to vary hugely. I can't give you a formula for this, but I can say that you're going to find it fairly quickly if you look at a small list of the people who are relevant to you. I would say the inverse is also valid. I mean, not everybody is a great person to follow, and there's a mute option there for a reason. So even people within your own discipline may shock or disappoint you based on the way in which they interact, and that's fine also. It's part of the practice, but do try and look for the opportunities there. Note that there's a value to approaching social media with personality and with relatable communication. So again, you don't want to just be popping those press releases in and being very sort of performative in what you do. there's a balance, of course, and we don't want to, devalue the sort of status we're trying to give ourselves in our research by, radically altering or radically vacillating between highly personal and highly professional content. But there's a huge value, I think, to showing the roundness of who you are, especially in the humanities, as you develop this kind of communication. So develop a dynamic that you think is interesting and accessible for the information you want to share and for the goals that you have within these spaces. And that's something that I think you'll see other people doing quite well. And so I can't give a list for all of your various disciplines, but there are a few people that I would recommend following immediately, just because I think they're excellent academics within the space of Twitter. So Mary Beard, who's a historian that I'm sure you all know, very good job of doing this. Zeynep Tufekci, the same science and tech columnist who does a lot of stuff around social media and society. The historian David Perry, I think, has a fantastic presence on Twitter, as does Niamh Ní Gabhain of the IHA itself. My colleague Tanya Lockhart, who's a protest researcher and who helped contribute to this presentation, I think is an excellent person as well to follow, as are the sort of political scholars Jennifer Canavan and Aidan Regan. And in both of those cases, I think what they do very well, Aidan Regan especially, is packaging information in ways that are useful to journalists, and their interaction with journalists builds their profile hugely, and I think is really responsible for that. I would note I would not recommend myself on this list or with these eminent people. You can follow me on Twitter if you like, but I mostly just talk about the Eurovision, and I don't give useful advice that you should emulate or follow. I promised I would finish with the one amazing secret of social media to clickbait you this far, and I hope you've stayed with me. The one amazing secret after my years of using it and after my discussion with Tanya is this: you don't have to engage with the people who engage with you. And this seems a very obvious thing, but it's very difficult not to, especially initially, and especially when you're early career and you want to build up your profile. It can seem like you need to respond to tags or to mentions of you, to discussions in your area, especially relevant hashtags. But there are important things to recognize specifically about Twitter, but social media in general. Many users are not discussing or arguing in good faith. They are there to build their own profile and to build their own sense of interaction. They have very different agendas to the one you might have with dissemination of your information or with meaningful contribution. Female academics, and Tanya was very vocal about this when we put together this presentation, the two of us, they're really problematically targeted and criticized more so than their male colleagues, and often very tangentially to their work. And so in addition to it being difficult for any of us, I think it's additionally difficult for female early career academics. And that's something to be wary of and to be mindful of as you interact. Quote tweeting, so people taking your output and then retweeting it themselves with a quote with an additional kind of descriptor. You're going to want to see that it's going to let you know when that's happening. You're going to get a notification, and some of that may be negative or some of that may be combative. And again, you need to decide whether it's worth getting involved with this sort of trolling that could happen there. Subtweeting is making reference to something that's said without directly tagging someone. And that again is a little bit more insidious, but often you can pick up on that very easily yourself if you know you are being talked about or the discourse that you're involved in is being talked about. It can be tempting to want to weigh in, but again, be very wary of whether that's actually valuable for you, especially in areas of contentious discourse. Protect your mental health in this space. It really does need protecting. Social media has a lot of positives for us in terms of how it can disseminate things, but it has a lot of negatives also. So limit that time that you're willing to give to it and use mute or block judiciously to try and manage the various bad actors that you may run into. On the whole, I think it's worth saying that for me and for many others, it's been hugely useful, especially within interdisciplinary spaces. And I don't want to end on a wholly negative note here, but I do want to say that you need to keep that context in mind as you use it, and that to get the best value out of it, it is useful for you to think about that. I'm going to finish at this point to let my other colleagues speak on their topics, and I'll have a look at the questions and respond to those in the chat as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dónal. That was very, very interesting and highly appropriate, I suppose, as a start to our social media part of today's doctoral training event. So I hand over to Fióna Gallagher. Fióna works at Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow, also at Dublin City University at the School of History and Geography. And she will be also giving us some advice on that matter. So Fióna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maxim. And I actually wish I had Dónal's talk before I started into doing blogs at all. I'm coming from a slightly different point of view in that maybe I'm perhaps a little bit more of the traditional academic in that journals and the written work is what I grew up with and what I'm used to. And so just to give you a little bit of background of what I am working on at the moment. I'm working on an interactive study of the 1832 cholera epidemic, and I'm hoping to map the geography and narrative and the comparative magnitude of the cholera pandemic on Irish provincial towns. So I was awarded the IRC scholarship last year, and I do think that as part of the application for that IRC grant, my blog, which I had started in April 2020 on the cholera epidemic, certainly helped perhaps sway the adjudicators into granting me the award. So I have been working on cholera for several years before I was awarded the postdoc. And just as the coronavirus started, I decided I would use some of this information in a blog and look at the parallels between a 19th century pandemic and a 21st century pandemic. So what I have there is just a little extract from the blog. You can look at it later rather than me trying to run through it there. And that was just a kind of an eye-catching top to the blog. And my website there, where the blog is. And also I've done some Sway work. Sway, for those of you who don't know, is sort of an online PowerPoint. And again, as Dónal was talking about, that was a collaborative work with another colleague in NUIG, and also with the OPW in relation to cholera graves in Sligo Abbey. And it was part of the process by where we couldn't have actually live tours of Sligo Abbey. So we had to get across the information in some way. You can have a look at that again. So why did I decide to blog? Well, I had very little interface with social media. I had no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram accounts. And it was very intimidating, as Dónal said, particularly perhaps for those of us who are a little bit older. But one of the reasons I started the blog was that as the epidemic, the coronavirus epidemic started, I had submitted an article to History Ireland on the epidemic, and they came back and say, oh no, somebody else has one, and they were accepting that one and not mine. And we all know what it feels like to have something submitted to any journal and somebody comes back. So I had no idea if that writer was working on cholera as an academic project or was just firing off an excellent article much quicker than me. So I set up the blog in response to that, so that I could actually, I suppose, disseminate my own research and have it out there and to be seen as an academic scholar on that particular topic. So how did I do it? So effectively what I did, just on the left-hand side of the slide there, is just a little bit of the blog. I try to interface with people in a sort of in a way that would attract them in terms of those little drawings there. They're colourful. So I did a short piece about every 7 days, focusing on a particular theme relating to the 1832 epidemic, and making always some oblique reference to the current situation, such as cholera riots and conspiracy theories, which had parallels in our own time. Each post was about 1,000 words long, and I always included at least 3 pictures, which I knew would catch attention, especially if viewed on a phone or an iPad. And then I would tweet the new post and anxiously wait for approval. And this ties into what Dónal was saying, is that really disseminating blog posts really is via Twitter, and Twitter is a whole other, I suppose, world of expectations. And what were my experiences of it? As again, coming maybe from a slightly older perspective, very time consuming. I put a lot of research and checking into each post before launching it, and that was all valuable data which I had gathered. Time then, I allocated some time to replying to queries, which in itself throws up particularly on Twitter, throws up a lot of queries, I had one person say to me, oh, that's all cut and paste from somewhere else, which is, not a discourse you want to have. There was a high level of interest due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but on a positive note, it really made some good contacts during the lockdown. Networking was excellent, particularly, as Dónal was saying, where you have a good handle, where you're interfacing with other academics as opposed to just the general public. And that was the Twitter end of it. It certainly helped to open doors to grants and academic progression, not just on the IRC, but effectively on a local level as well. I was able to avail of several local grants, particularly looking at stuff for the OPW and other smaller grants on a local scale here. One of the big questions I always had was, who were my audience? What were their expectations? What were mine? And was the blog hitting an academic audience? And that ties into what Dónal was saying again about dissemination. And I suppose all of that leads us to some of the questions really around academic blogging. So I'm thinking in terms of, perhaps younger PhD students or master's students, where you have an enormous course load. You're trying to migrate from sort of undergraduate writing to this very dense, very focused PhD style of writing, as well as doing your actual research in a historical context. So we've all been there. We've all, been trying to rewrite a whole chapter in a week. And should you blog or should you do anything else at all beside that? So one of the benefits, and Dónal's touched on it, it definitely exercises the students' creative expertise, because PhD authors are professional communicators operating in a very specialized environment. So blogs should really be no different. And regular writing for any student also sharpens the mind and promotes self-expression. And of course, if you use a blog or Twitter, you engage with a very modern method of diffusion, one that we're still only really coming to terms with there. I certainly think it improves the communication skills, and it also is a permanent portfolio of work, particularly if you have your own blogging site. And confidence, the feedback is great. It boosts your competence, Cons, time consuming, time. Should I rewrite that chapter 5 again, or will I do my blog? One of the things I had was fear of being cut and pasted. Am I putting all my hard-earned work out there for people to cut and paste? Or am I copying somebody else's work? I had one particular graph on the blog, which is the monies given to the different boards of health. And I had done a particular graph on it. And I did see it got shared a lot in terms of the money spent in 1832. But I did see it turn up on one or two places where I would have liked to be cited on it. And that was original work. One of the key issues, and I think Donald touched on it as well, is the blog a safe academic environment, particularly for postgrads? We all know for me, it was a Thursday night seminar where you get up in front of your contemporaries or your classmates or your in your department, and you give a presentation, and it's interrogated and robustly, and you defend it. That's fine in a proper academic environment, but as we've seen online, particularly for female academics, it can be tricky. So that's just something to think about. Are you prepared for those negative comments? Will those negative comments derail your research? And there's also the fear that the provision of your work online, it will be used and plagiarized, or that half-formed ideas may be taken from you and turned into somebody else's paper. So, are you fair game on a blog on the internet? So there's a question to ask yourself as a postdoctorate or a post-grad scholar. And online writing can be a different dynamic than writing the style of a PhD. So again, that's time consuming. A short attention period, it's fine for a week. Nobody who's looking at my blog now, not sure. And can it be found again? Whereas I regularly cite journals, articles from journals, particularly medical history journals, which are over 100 years old, and I can find them again. So as a student, think of those sort of things. And again, that leads me to some of the academic questions. Can you cite blogs? If you can, what is the format? Find that out. How do I verify the information in them? And that's a question for all sorts of blogs. Are they peer reviewed? Some not. How do you discriminate effectively between them? And again, as Donald touched on, what's good practice when you write? How do you portray your professional projection of ideas versus your personal projection of ideas? And they're two very different things, again, particularly for women. And I think some of you may have seen the debate on Twitter, possibly last year, some stage during the lockdown, over whether you should colorize black and white photographs or not. And that developed into a whole, quite a deep Twitter discourse that had repercussions, I suppose, as to how you view photographs in general from a historical point of view. Some practical questions, again, for postgrad students. Am I expected to have an online presence as a postgrad? That's up to yourself and your department and your supervisor. How much time and energy does it take? Set yourself a limit. Will it distract me from my main work, which is to write the PhD or write the master's? And as Donald said as well, you really have to look after your mental health in this. I found Twitter particularly abrasive at times. I won't say I didn't have a bad experience with it, but you really have to work hard to keep that dissemination very professional focused and not at all personal focused. Think before you tweet. Never tweet at night. Never tweet when you're feeling a little bit off with what somebody has said. So think twice and think 10 times actually. Will a blog be useful? Will social media be useful for my PhD, or is it more useful for postdoc engagement, which I found was good? How do I disseminate it? Again, Twitter focus is really the main avenue here. So, and what are my expectations, as we've said again, of the blog, and am I interesting to follow? So before you get into it, think of all those questions and see what you want to do then. And just to kind of finish it up, I would say give it a go. And I would give it a go by getting onto Dr. Mel Farrell there and the Irish Humanities Alliance website. They have an excellent, I suppose, vehicle for you to give a blog a go. You can do a one-off post. There's good academic oversight, ease of dissemination because the IHA has embedded tweets and tweets embedded tweets in the page and also online. Good focused audience. All the major colleges are there, and it's an appropriate audience. Less stress. One-off blog is a lot less stress than many pages, and it's easy to reference. I often go back in and look at different blogs on the IHA site and podcasts as well, and they're a very good vector to an academic audience. And just we just finish off there with a little quote from Rowan Meitzen. I think she's a long-established blogger and a professor of English in Canada. And she said, "I do not think every academic should blog, and that it shouldn't replace the other ways in which we carry out our work as intellectuals and educators. But she is convinced that academic blogging can and should have an acknowledged place in the overall ecology of scholarship." So I'll just leave you with that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiona. Obviously, you couldn't have been a better advocate for the work of IHA, especially the last slide and all the opportunities that IHA presents to its members. And as its IHA Vice Chair, I would encourage PhD researchers to engage with IHA and also provide some content for IHA blogs. And obviously, we are much forward. We're very much looking forward to receiving some submissions after that particular event today. Our last speaker is my venerable colleague, Dr. Leanne McCormick from Ulster University. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Leanne to this event. She published widely on the areas relating to sexuality, women, and history of medicine. She also runs a Center for the History of Medicine at Ulster University, which is partly funded through Wellcome Trust as well. She's the co-author of the Modern Baby Homes and Magdalene Laundries in Northern Ireland report published in January 2021. And Leanne was particularly successful in getting a few AHRC-funded projects, among them Queer Northern Ireland and also Bad Bridget. So all over to you, Leanne. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Maxim. And what I'm going to talk to you today about are podcasts and in particular the Bad Bridget podcast, which I have been involved with Dr. Leanne Farrell from Queen's. And it came out of the Bad Bridget project, the HRC funded Bad Bridget project, which Leanne and I have been working on from 2015. If you haven't listened to the Bad Bridget podcast, please do. You don't even have to listen to it. You could just give us a 5-star rating. We'd be happy with that. Anyway, and you can get it on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you just put in Bad Bridget podcast. And what I want to talk to you about today is just very briefly about our experience of doing a podcast. And some sort of things to think about if you are thinking about doing a podcast, and sort of the benefits and also the cons of it. And listening to both Fióna and Dónal there, some of the very same issues that came through in terms of podcasting. That image of us together there is not where we recorded a podcast at all. That was just it was nothing as fancy as that, I'm afraid. So we were approached by one of the communication staff at Queen's about doing a podcast in sort of just after lockdown really started in 2020. Now, we hadn't planned to do a podcast. A podcast wasn't one of the outputs for the project. It was nothing that we had necessarily planned to do. And I suppose as lockdown began, lots of people were thinking about podcasts, and from then on, they've become incredibly popular. Everybody seems to have a podcast or thinking about doing a podcast now. And we sort of were a bit reluctant. I loved podcasts, listened to a lot of podcasts kind of up to that point. Leanne wasn't as interested in podcasts at the time. I think she's listened to more now. But we kind of sat down and had thought about, would we want to do this? How would we want it to, what sort of format would we want? I was very keen that we would do something that was relatively short episodes. We wanted something that was quite informal, that sounded like it was us chatting, but had different things interspersed in it. The podcasts that I listen to, I like ones that have got, are kind of interviewee, but are quite chatty, that they're funny, that they're quite relaxed. And what I haven't done is put up a list of, there are lots of really good history podcasts out there. I sort of started to do a list, and then I was too frightened that I was going to leave somebody off or offend somebody. So again, if you've got any recommendations that you wanted to share in the chat as well, that would be really good too, because there are some excellent podcasts, history podcasts out there. I wasn't a huge fan of very long podcasts or ones that I have a short attention span. I needed something that was going to keep me interested. So that was kind of what we began to think about, how we would do ours and what we would do. We really hadn't got a clue how to begin the process or what way we would try to do it. And we sort of did some the initial first ones that we did, we tried on over Zoom. They really didn't work at all. They came across kind of, it just felt very stilted. And we were at a point where there were some relaxations in lockdown, and we were able to get into a room together. We were quite far apart, but that was a big difference for us in terms of the chemistry, in terms of just that energy in the room. And we had, it was good fun to do them when we were together. Then we had to do lots of bits and pieces and re-record bits and try to do interviews and things remotely. So it can be very time consuming. And, as Fiona was saying about blogs, you've got to think about the time that these can take. They do require a lot of effort. We semi-scripted ours, so we kind of knew where we were going and knew what the focus was. And again, if you're using your own research, you will have a lot of that material perhaps on hand. But if it's not necessarily your specialist area you may be talking about, you will have other work to do. So think about those things and think about how you're doing it. I suppose the key thing for us was to think about our audience. We knew that we wanted to sort of pitch these for a general public and an interested public. And, I've got sort of some things to think about in a slide later on, and that's really a key one, I think, is about who you are pitching this to. Is this something that you think, I want to do a podcast for other academics? I want to do something that is maybe pitched at undergraduate students? Is it pitched at school children? Is it pitched at a general public? So thinking about that will really shape your approach and how you do it, because whether just somebody in the general public is going to listen to an hour's episode on something that is quite dense and academic, are they going to listen to something sort of shorter? Can you make it accessible? Or is this something that is pitched, at quite an academic audience? And I have used some excellent podcasts which are very academic in their approach, particularly in teaching, because they're really, really good for students to access a lot of information really quite quickly and in a different format. So we were very fortunate. We put the podcasts out at the end of, or they dropped in terminology, at the end of December. We recorded all of ours at the one time, sort of over several months really, and they were all ready to go. And then we released a few at a time, one week and a few the next week. Again, that's something to think about, how many podcasts you're committing to. Is this something that you think, I'm going to do this weekly? And you may record, generally people record maybe several at one time, or try to keep up a library that they're ready to. They're not necessarily having to record each week, but record quite a few at a time. Is it a long-term thing that you want to do? Or are you thinking we'll maybe just do a few and see how it goes. So it's thinking about all those things before you start, and you're not promising people. You'll see sort of lots of famous people who do podcasts who say, I promised one once a week, and now it's actually really hard to try and maintain that. So think about how many you want to do and what you're going to do. We made these. We got quite, in January, suddenly quite a lot of publicity about them. We had articles in The Guardian, the Daily Mail. We went on Women's Hour, on the Irish Times Women's Podcast, and again, quite a lot of traction across social media about the podcast, which again really helped and really boosted our listening numbers, and quite a lot of reviews and all sorts of places where people really did engage with them and really seem to be enjoying the podcasts as well. And in terms of the success of them, and there was a point where we were looking at Chartable a lot to see how they were going, but they were at one point number one in the History Podcast in Ireland, number two in all podcasts in Ireland, and two in History Podcast in GB, and number 14 in the History Podcasts in the States, which was amazing as well. And we were in the top 10 in a whole variety of other countries, sort of Cyprus and Sri Lanka and all sorts of places that we didn't think would be that interested in Bad Bridget's. So we were really pleased and kind of quite surprised by the success of the podcast, and so were other people as well, including this article in the Times, which was talking about how it had zoomed up the podcast charts, this unlikely hit. And it in terms of history podcasts, I suppose it can be unlikely that they will be sort of successful, that people will listen to them. So I think it's worth keeping expectations about these as well. Whenever we started out, I thought my mum might listen. Leanne didn't even think her mum would listen. So that was sort of where we were coming from about how successful they would be. And we were also really fortunate that we had Siobhan McSweeney, who I'm sure you'll all know from Dairy Girls and Pottery Throwdown and other fabulous things, did the introduction for us, and she did some of the pieces throughout. And we just approached her agent and asked if she'd be interested in doing it. Now, one of the positives, I suppose, about the pandemic was that when we were doing this was a point where all theatres had shut and nothing was being filmed. So for actors, it was probably a good time for somebody to come on board. So Siobhan did these for us. And we had other really excellent people involved. Francesca Schroeder and Katrina Gribben did the music for us, and if you listen, you'll hear the music behind, and they were amazing at kind of coming up with those ideas too. We had another actor, Marty McGuire, voice some things. We'd a bit of artwork done for us by PhD Cartoon, and some help in terms of production and editing from within Queen's as well. And this was sort of the image for Bad Bridget too. And we also had a number of interviews from other academics that came on. And to be honest, we were fortunate there because we were able to kind of go and talk to our friends and persuade them to come and do a little bit of an interview for us. Now, we were fortunate in that we had access to some funding for these. We didn't have wasn't a huge amount of money, but we were able to pay everybody who contributed something small. And that's, again, costs or something really to think about. And it may be that you are able to access funding from a funder or from your institution. You don't need that, and that will also depend on the people that you have involved, whether you need to pay people or whether you can sort of do without that. But we were very clear about when we were doing it that we did want to offer people something. It wasn't very much, but it was a token anyway, and something that to appreciate what people were doing for us and the help that we were getting. I did say that we weren't in the Great Hall at Queen's recording these. Here we are in our spare bedrooms, recording them and trying to get things sorted with our furry mics there in the picture. And just really to finish up, to sort of think about some things to think about. If you are thinking about a podcast, think about why you want to do it. They are great ways about communicating ideas with a varied audience. They absolutely are. They're brilliant to get your research, to get your ideas out there, but they do take up a lot of time. And you've got to think about why you want to do it. Is it to tell people about your research? Is it to discuss bigger ideas? Is it part of a project? And I think increasingly people are factoring podcasts into projects when they're going for funding or as sort of part of their research. Ours was really worked out really well for us, both in terms of the fact that it did generate a lot of interest in the project. People were generally really positive about it. It created much more around the sort of Bad Bridget. We ended up trademarking the Bad Bridget name, and it meant that we thought very differently too about how we communicated our research. And we're working on a book at the minute which is focused on a general public audience rather than an academic audience. And we're working on an exhibition that will open in the Ulster American Folk Park in Oma in Easter, which is again translating that research for a general public. It is a crowded market, and you do have to think about the type of podcast that you want to do and how you are going to differentiate yourself from what's out there, or will you do it differently, or will you do it, keep it sort of quite similar. Think about what you like to listen to, I think is key in this, and about what you think other people will be interested too. And what you want it to be about. We did have this research ready to go. We've been working on this from 2015. So we had a lot of material. And as Fiona mentioned, there are issues about putting your work out there, about you put it out into the ether, it's available for other people to take and use in ways which you might not have foreseen and have wanted to. So, thinking about what you're doing and whether the work is there. Are you the expert on this, whatever you want to talk about? And I'm thinking particularly that these are going to be based on, academic type podcasts and based on your research. If you're not the expert, do you need to bring that expert in? Can you do that? Is that the format of your podcast? We were also very keen that we wanted to make sure that we named and identified people who were working in the area. We didn't want to slip into, suddenly, are you stealing my research, or you're talking about my work and not acknowledging me? So you've got to think about those sort of things too. Who'll be involved? Doing with other people is great fun. But again, you do have to think about, do you need to pay people to be involved? And sort of those costs come later on, as well. But, how much time are you asking people to be involved? Do you want to interview people? Do you want to talk to people? Do you need to get information from people? So it's about thinking about all those issues in there as well. And how you produce it. We did use just little handheld recorders. We couldn't at the time of lockdown get in to record the recording studios within either Ulster or Queen's, just because of the sort of the social distancing and things. Again, with lockdown easing, you're able to maybe access those things. Most institutions perhaps will have facilities that you can use. A lot of the software to produce podcasts is available free online. And again, it's maybe working out your technical know-how. Do you have that know-how? Do you need to get some training? Is there somebody who can help you with that? And trying to keep your sound quality as good as possible. That's one of the things I think that's really important in podcasts now, and how you can do that and where you can record. And if you're interviewing people, that's one of the things that we had some issues with about. We were interviewing sometimes people in the States, and it was about trying to keep sound quality up and things as well. And also sort of, again, things about the format and what you want to do and how will you manage to sort of include all those things within it. And just finally, a kind of a point again that's been raised as well is about thinking about taking the good and the bad. This is just one of the comments that we had. So that's unsolicited feedback. Again, somebody who just didn't agree with what we were saying and what we were doing. And if you do a podcast, the reviews and ratings can appear. You can put in your review and your rating. So you've got to, if you're putting your work out there and putting yourself out there, and in a podcast, you do put quite a bit of yourself out there. You've got to be prepared that somebody may not like what you've said, may not agree with it, and is going to kind of comment publicly about that as well. So all of those things are just to consider. So just to say, hopefully you might think about having a go at a podcast. I had never anticipated doing it. I really enjoyed doing it. I was delighted at the way it all came together and how it turned out. There are some excellent podcasts out there. Some of you may well have done a podcast and have got sort of experience to share about that as well, and how to put those together. But do take care about thinking about the time that it will take, what the purpose of it is for you. Is it going to benefit you in the long run, or is it something that you just want to do for fun and enjoyment? And it may lead other directions. It may open up all sorts of other doors, and it is a great way to communicate your research. So good luck with anybody who does decide to go ahead with doing a podcast. Thanks very much.
Well, that's been very inspirational. Thank you very much, Leanne. I very much enjoyed you talking about your experience. Yeah, there's one for Leanne. Have you considered peer reviewing your podcast?
That's a really good question. No, but I can see that there's, and I think as things develop, I can see that there are lots of areas where it might be something that we think about doing, and that there's a way of looking at what material goes into podcasts. And I suppose perhaps, and this may be already sort of been happening there, where whether journals or publishing houses as well think are doing podcasts, and that somehow work will be peer reviewed and appear in a different format as well. And I'm sure that's kind of, somebody's probably able to tell me that is happening somewhere else. So it wasn't something that we thought about doing, or and I suppose a lot of the work from the podcast and a lot of the ideas and things we discussed will appear in other published formats as well. But I think there's lots of potential, yes, so that those podcasts can have that more sort of academic.
Thanks. Yeah, well, Dónal is still with us, hasn't left. So Dónal, do you have a question on trolling? Because there was one of the very first questions to your talk.
I did. I just noticed that. I'm sorry for missing that at the time. I think it was partly answered by what I said towards the end with that idea that you really don't need to engage with people who are engaging with you, especially if you believe them to be engaging in back faith. I think that is something that you just have to keep in mind, and I absolutely acknowledge how difficult that is sometimes, especially if you feel that your worth in that space is being questioned, or indeed the work that you have done or the work that colleagues have done is being questioned. There are tools there to report things within that space, and I think they need to be used. Too often we don't, and we can ignore a lot of abuse within that space, especially on Twitter. There's greater moves to try and manage that by Twitter themselves, but they're constantly reminding us that they need to be sort of user driven, and we need to kind of report that. So that's something to consider as well if you find stuff particularly egregious. But I think in general there is a lot of problematic discourse, let's say, antagonistic stuff within that space that is just best avoided and not coordinated with it all.
Yeah, and protect your mental health along the way as well.
100%. Yeah, and I was delighted to see that picked up by my other two colleagues there as well.
Yeah.
I'll sorry if I could briefly say one thing before, because I have to run. I'm really sorry everybody to have to run, but I saw the other question about representing the stuff in funding calls and things like that. I think it's always a good idea to pin to the top of your Twitter, if you're going to share your Twitter handle in your CV or in your things, some of your research or some recent outputs that you might have there, because it's a good place that when the person goes to your profile, it's the first thing they'll see. And so rather than them happening to see your opinion on Bake Off or whatever it is, they'll get something that's relevant there, but you'll still have the rest of your discourse. I think podcasts, in my experience certainly, and that of my colleagues here in DCU, have been well received as part of funding calls and are considered a good well structured output and publication, and Leanne will discuss that more. And I think having had a blog previously that's well structured really just speaks to the quality of your dissemination, and funders love that. So it is useful in that way. My apologies again to have to run, but thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Donald. Much appreciated. Yeah. There's a question for Fióna as well. Fióna, could you please consider if it's better to have a blog for yourself as an academic, or if it's better to do it for a project?
Ooh, okay, I've done them for both. Let me, I suppose, put it that way. My original blog in 2020 was a personal in a professional way, and I think it's really important to separate the two. But in terms of collaborative work, as a project, I've done. I think in the last summer, I've done 2 collaborative sort of blogs. They're Sway presentations. Anybody who's familiar with Sway is kind of like PowerPoint for the internet. One with Dr. Robert Hensey from NUIG, who's an archaeologist, and we did work in conjunction with the OPW in relation to the cholera burials in Sligo Abbey. And we had a lot of information in that Sway presentation. And it was, I found that quite a different medium to work in, and also it was disseminated by the Heritage Council, so it got quite a lot of views, and it substituted for not being able to take people around the Abbey. So I've had that answer to the actual question. I like the collaborative work because I think it also, for the other gentleman that I was working with, he hadn't done anything like this before either, both of us being of a certain age, I suppose. So it was good development, professional development for us to work in that particular medium. And we got a very good positive feedback. And because it's not Twitter based, it didn't get into any of this, I'd call it a ping pong. So I would, but keep everything, really separate your own personal life, never get involved with dissemination where it becomes personal. Switch it off, don't look at it, keep it as if you were lecturing a group of students, keep it very professional.
Thank you, Fióna. Yeah, Leanne, we have to come back to you because there's a few questions from the audience as well in relation to some technical requirements for making a podcast, types of microphones or software that you would use, because obviously people could be. I was also listening to you, was fascinated with the approach you've taken in relation to illustration, animation, obviously approaching the artists to do some attractive artwork for your blog. That was a very good approach to take. So yes.
We recorded, because there were 2 of us and we were recording, we couldn't, and again, this is sort of, things are changing slightly now with as we move out of lockdown. I think that it would be easier for people, particularly people who are recording maybe with more than one person. We recorded on separate, just little handheld recorders. We used Tascam ones. I'm not pronouncing that. Tascam ones, TASCAM, but you can get lots of them, not particularly expensive. And we did use the kind of furry. That's not the particular. So there's a proper term for it, but if you know what I mean, the furry cover for the microphone for the sound. So we recorded them both separately, and then they were put together as such. And the software, and I've completely forgotten the name of the software that you can get free online, that you can sort of use that to put podcasts together. We did have somebody, Colm Heatley at Queen's, put the recordings together for us. So we did take a lot of time about, it was a lot of counting in to make sure that we were clicking on at the same time, that we knew we were careful about. And it was a learning curve for us because we didn't have a clue what we were doing to begin with. So there were quite a few bits that were all wrong. And when we tried to do interviews, that we got the timings wrong, and that we were, cutting things and all sorts of things. And we did get somebody at Queen's, John Darcy, again, helped us to kind of make it just sound a little bit better, to do the sound work. But again, a lot of institutions, do have studios now that people can use and can access, and that you may be able to get, again, training and access sort of training and any help for that as well. So we didn't use anything particularly technical, but again, you can, if you're able to get into a studio, you would be able to kind of use sort of much higher end equipment than we had as well for that.
I suppose, thank you, Leanne. The next question would be to Fióna. You have mentioned that the blog that you've been working had been very important for your success with funding. And there's the question from the audience. How did you portray the success of your blog engagement in the research proposals? And in your opinion, which indicators mattered when you did that?
Okay, well, I suppose it's anybody who's done an IRC application knows that it's painfully painful, So, but I think what you're trying to do with any application is build up a repertoire of work. So you have published works, you have thesis, or you have your thesis, you have articles, whatever. But because my application was specifically based on a further study of cholera, the fact that I had, I suppose, a dense blog, for want of a better word, which was in existence before I applied for the IRC grant. I think that demonstrated to the adjudicators of the grant that I was serious about what I wanted to do, and that I had thought through it. And I suppose the quality of the writing and the quality of engagement helps, because what's really important in any postdoctoral or even postgrad work is they always want to know, particularly with grant funding, is how are you going to disseminate this information? It's no good sitting in a hardcover in UCD library or where nobody sees it. So I think the modern focus on grant awards is how are you going to disseminate to this, both academia and indeed to the general public. So that's my feeling on it.
Yeah, and probably we can't take all the questions that are coming. There's very good engagement with the audience, and thank you very much for fitting all these questions. But probably a very short question to both Leanne and Fiona, whether you have considered switching and changing your podcasts or blogs into formal academic scholarly publications. Would that be an option, or you think it's a totally different space altogether?
We have sort of expanded and adapted, I suppose, some of the things that we've developed in the podcast into a book, but it is a book that's pitched more at a general audience. We're trying to do that complicated thing of doing something that's academic but publicly accessible as well. So we'll see if we're successful or not. But I think that they're as I think when Fiona was talking about the different types of writing, it's a very different way of writing and thinking about your research. Sometimes that's very good to push you out of the academic space, and to think about how you can communicate that more effectively and in a more concisely often. And I think that, again, Fiona made a very valid point about how funders are keen. It's about impact, particularly in UK universities. It's about impact. It's about how you are able to communicate. And I think that both things like podcasts and blogs are really, really good at forcing you into doing that and thinking about your research. And I think that ultimately helps you in terms of more academic, formal writing as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with Leanne on that. I mean, I have done a podcast on the cholera. It totally escapes me now who it was. It was again a funded podcast, and I did it over the internet during the lockdown, when it was very popular. I think in terms of turning one medium into the other, it's still very, 20 years ago, none of this really existed, so for those of us, I suppose, of a certain age, it's still quite new, if you've grown up with it, you have a different idea of it. Again, back Leanne, it's all about time. What are your other commitments as a lecturer, as a student in particular? And what is the impact of what you do? Is the blog more impact? Is the podcast more impact? Bad Bridget has been phenomenal, thanks to Leanne and her colleagues. So you think, again, as a student, because I'm very aware this is aimed at students, how much can you do in the time you have, and what benefit will it be to you? You can think differently, maybe perhaps postdoctorally, but focus on what you need to get done, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Leanne. Mel, I think I want to hand it over back to you as the organizer to say a few final words.
Thank you, Maxim. Indeed, I just want to thank both panels. I think we've had two very constructive sessions today. I think all attendees have learned a great deal about the academic publishing landscape, and again about the complex area of social media, blogging, podcasting. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists earlier in this morning's session, and again now in this afternoon's session. I'd also like to thank the attendees. We had a full Zoom room. We had between this morning and today, we had over 89 attendees at one point this morning, and the questions that came in were very engaging. Some really important issues as well, I thought, were raised, particularly in this session, about the social media landscape and some of the implications of it. So it's really important, I guess. When I was starting out as a PhD student quite a while ago now, certainly Twitter wasn't a consideration at that point, or podcasting. So it is something that's grown, over the last 10 years in importance, and it's really good to see it being discussed in this way. I was particularly interested in some of the opportunities that these mediums have opened up for our panelists as well. I thought that was really interesting. So again, just to thank everybody, to thank the two chairs as well for chairing both sessions. And I think there's certainly an appetite to keep the conversation going. And I'm sure that we can do that through the Irish Humanities Alliance.